Now, this statement has been drafted by Jeff Steinberg, and it concerns a Glass-Steagall fight, and it's titled Wall Street Mafia in Desperate Drive to Stop Glass-Steagall. The criminal enterprise known as the Wall Street Too Big to Fail Banks is engaged in a desperate effort to block passage of Glass-Steagall. Bills have been introduced in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate to reinstate the 1933 legislation that broke up the banks into totally separate commercial and investment entities. Through a lobbying effort estimated to have cost more than $300 million, Wall Street was able to repeal Glass-Steagall in 1999. So far, 25 state legislatures have introduced or passed resolutions demanding that their congressional delegations support Glass-Steagall's passage. And major labor, farm, and civil rights organizations have also fully endorsed the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall separation. In response to that nationwide outpouring of support for Glass-Steagall, Wall Street has responded with a four-pronged assault to block passage, according to well-placed Washington sources. These reports grid precisely with evidence directly obtained by LaRouchePAC organizers. First, the Big Six Wall Street banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo have unleashed their lobbyists and trade associations to target state legislators backing the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. Evidence of this operation has already surfaced in Delaware, Minnesota, South Dakota, and in California. Second, members of the U.S. House and Senate have been personally contacted by top officials of the Big Six banks and threatened with loss of campaign support and with loss of thousands of jobs in their districts unless they drop their support for the Glass-Steagall bills. Third, the CEOs and other top executives of too big to fail banks have been placing personal calls to congressional leaders and other pro-Glass-Steagall influential figures, further threatening reprisals against any people who persist in pressing for Glass-Steagall. Fourth, LaRouchePAC activists mobilizing support for Glass-Steagall have been targeted for physical attacks, vandalism, police harassment, and other active measures to blunt the growing support for breaking up the banks and throwing the top Wall Street criminals in jail. These attacks have been organized on a local-by-local basis, using whatever hooligan elements can be hired to carry out those attacks. According to one informed Washington source, Wall Street and the Obama White House were caught completely off guard by the rapid escalation of support for Glass-Steagall. The movement toward passage of the reinstatement bills moved ahead far more rapidly than anyone in the administration or the Big Six banks had expected. The fact that half of the state legislatures in the country, including New York and California, introduced resolutions calling for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall indicated a level of mass public support that posed an existential threat to the very survival of the too-big-to-fail criminal enterprises of Wall Street. It should be no surprise that the too-big-to-fail banks have resorted to mafia tactics to push back against the momentum for Glass-Steagall. The banks are being protected from long overdue criminal prosecution by the Obama White House and the Justice Department, which has officially adopted the Holder Doctrine, under which the big banks, particularly their top executives, have been given a literal license to steal and murder with immunity from prosecution. With Detroit showcasing the outright genocidal consequences of such policies, as a rating of the LIBOR interest rates and the manipulation of interest rate swaps to loot the already desperate city budgets, the ability of the Obama administration to continue their protection racket is running up against a growing popular rage. The desperate Wall Street actions targeting Glass-Steagall are criminal in their own right. Given these facts, would you please make your opening remarks.
Well, the significance of this is the fact that the relevant people have been caught right-handed, left-handed, and backhanded. And they are now, in the sense of subject to a thorough investigation before and after this proceeding is completed. In other words, they're not going to get away from gay with this on their own basis, because they're still subject to what they've done in fraud in this case. This means hope for the United States, because the acts that have taken and the fact that they are traced to these agencies, not just these banks, but political institutions which are responsible for this sort of stuff. And therefore, that means that unless Glass-Steagall is automatically victorious in this matter, then the question is how much fraud was perpetrated in order to bring about a defeat of Glass-Steagall. So the issue is not settled. It can be settled by a victory of Glass-Steagall, but it cannot otherwise. The fact that this thing, what are charges that are made in terms of reporting facts, and they are reported facts, that means that you've got something very dirty going on, and it can lead to very serious consequences for members of the Congress. Because in some cases this was done, or was being done, under the instigation of members of the Congress and their agents. So it's a very hot situation. The other side of the thing is the positive side, is the fact that these guys were caught without, caught out. They had no anticipation of such an event as occurring in that form. Indicates the importance and the probable victory, which probably lies, an honest victory, lies in the hands of those who are defending the Glass-Steagall reenactment. And therefore anything that's done which gets even close to that kind of problem, where there's a doubt about who actually got the vote, and whether intimidation was used, which is really a felony. If intimidation was used to effect a defeat of the Glass-Steagall motion, then that's another issue. So,
what Wall Street fears is their own death brought about by the hands of the people led by the certain trumpet of Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Our activity across the nation has demonstrated that, indeed, we have the power to shut down this deadly criminal operation. With the introduction this past week of Assembly Concurrent Resolution 73 in California, which urges the President and the Congress of the United States to enact federal legislation to protect the public interests by reviving the separation between commercial banking and speculative activity embodied in the Glass-Steagall Act. Half the states of the Union have some sort of official activity on the books calling for the restoration of Glass-Steagall.
LaRouche put out the call. He said that we're going to take the states for Glass-Steagall, to memorialize Glass-Steagall, and create an impetus in the nation for the Congress to reverse its cowardly ways and enact Glass-Steagall. So California obviously was, as it was said, a tough nut to crack. But, we set out to do it.
I mean, we set the goal to get 20 state legislatures introducing a Glass-Steagall bill, maybe to be done by maybe 2 months ago.
So I think back in April, we amassed a contingent of about 15 contacts, not to mention the full-time LaRouchePAC organizing staff in San Francisco for a blitzkrieg against the state capitol.
We're seeing a certain takeoff point, and then at the culmination of that, you see a new bill introduced into the Senate making it 2 bills in the Senate, and then we have over 70 co-sponsors now on the House bill, H.R. 129.
But yeah, I mean, we basically went to every office. We thoroughly briefed the staff members, or aides mostly, and the assembly people and the senators in the hallways if we were able to catch them. And, you know, there's a superficial agreement with Glass-Steagall, you know, which is it's hard to gauge whether or not some people are actually committed in principle to actually ramming it through and being a champion for Glass-Steagall.
I think what's interesting is that all the while during this period, what was the line? What was being said about it? You'll never get Glass-Steagall through. It's not possible. Wall Street's got too much power, and Congress is too corrupt, and the American people are too stupid. All of which are true, but nonetheless, you've seen a certain break in terms of what is the status quo, and now we have serious momentum. And I think that, what we've seen reflected like in California, but then in every other one of the state legislatures, as well as generally in public, as you've seen, I think a real case study in the fallacy of popular opinion, in thinking that you can play it safe by following the trend lines of one thing or the other, as opposed to realizing that, which is what we've communicated to the better people in the state houses who have put forward bills, is look, this system's coming down.
And then, of course, all the excuses came out. Glass-Steagall wouldn't have prevented the crisis of '08, and it's a dated piece of legislation, and the Volcker rule needs to be given time to work, and all the excuses came out. So the responses ran the gamut of staff members or aides actually running interference against our organizers, some of whom actually having had made appointments to speak with staff, having them come in and cut in and say, the staff member has an important meeting and he no longer can speak with you, to what happened 2 weeks ago, which was myself and 2 other LaRouchePAC organizers actually sitting down with a high-ranking staff member discussing which bill in the Senate we wanted articulated in the language of the bill, the 800 series bill or the 1200 series bill. So it was very exciting in a few short months. And also, what was interesting too, that very same day, we decided to immediately proceed to organize for sponsorship, co-sponsorship of the bill. I proceeded to go into another assemblyman's office, or a senator. I walked into his office and I showed him the actual language in the bill and the cover letter, and he was in a state of shock, almost literally. And he had realized that, through 3 months, 4 months of stonewalling on Glass-Steagall, and I handed him the bill, and it turns out he was on the wrong side of the wall. So much so that his hand was trembling as he stapled the paperwork together. It was passing on to the senator. So it was pretty exciting. And then one of our other organizers had been organizing within the Senate too. And as soon as I step out, this other staff member from an adjacent senator's office comes in, closes the door behind this other staff member whom I just gave the information to, and what I presume to put the exclamation point on what we had said, what we had done. So we have the bill now, and you can chalk one up to LaRouche.
Before Detroit went, we were saying genocide. Before you had any of these kinds of more developed things that you've seen in the recent days, we were saying this is a policy which is absolute destruction for the American people and the world. And despite the opposition, and the opposition is actually growing now because of all the momentum that we're creating, despite all that, we've actually seen the very real example where we as a movement are really taking off. And I think that if more people would drop their thinking around just what's practical, what's it look like might happen, what is my neighbor's best friend think should happen, and just drop it and realize that we are in a moment where great things can happen that you didn't expect otherwise. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with this Glass-Steagall fight right now.
This past week, the first week of the congressional recess, we have continued the mobilization on Glass-Steagall into the California State House and around the nation. Michael Steger of the Policy Committee discusses this in light of what led the Friday webcast, namely the blowback and counter-operations against our work.
What we've got to do now is create a juggernaut. We've got to build that landslide kind of victory of support, which in essence is there. And it's there because of two key factors. One is what you're describing with this blowback. It's pathetic. It is an attempt by a schoolyard bully who just peed his pants to try to beat everybody up. And as long as someone's willing to say, you're a fat slob who just peed your pants, you probably need to go have some quiet time somewhere at the school nurse's office, or in this case, behind bars with these Wall Street bankers. Then that will change the course of history. But all it is brute intimidation. So we've had some bankers call up the various state assembly members and tell them to drop the resolution. They said, no, we're not going to do it. It wasn't like it was a surprise. It wasn't like a Wall Street banker calling you or their lobby group calling you and saying, we don't like this resolution, is going to surprise somebody. Oh, really? You don't like this? Geez, I wonder why. The more surprising factor was when we talked to a state assemblywoman's office from San Bernardino. Now, this is a city that's been ravaged the same way Detroit has. It's just on a smaller scale, so it didn't get national headlines. And it's the same kind of process that happened in Stockton. It was a huge housing bubble. A bunch of houses were built for this 2-hour commute into the Los Angeles kind of business side of things for work. And it blew out. And you have rampant poverty, large minority groups, and the city's been devastated, and it's massively gang-infested because of it. It's a huge drug center. So this office, likely because of Obama's direct intervention, he comes into Los Angeles last week to meet with DreamWorks, Arnold Schwarzenegger's friends at DreamWorks, and probably had some words to say about his African-American friends in Los Angeles. And it's pure intimidation. And these guys know it. I mean, we've talked to a leading senior state senator from Los Angeles, African-American, who said, Glass-Steagall, there's no reason to support it because this president is so in bed with Wall Street, it will never pass. So these guys know it, but it doesn't mean that brute intimidation and dangling a little carrot in front of them doesn't necessarily get them to do some kind of Pinocchio dance. And in a sense, this office said, look, we can't support this resolution because it's got Lyndon LaRouche's name in it. Oh, well, why not? Why can't you support a resolution with Lyndon LaRouche's name on it? Oh, because he thinks Obama's supporting Al-Qaeda. What do you mean he thinks Obama's supporting Al-Qaeda? The State Department said Obama's supporting Al-Qaeda. Oh, well, he thinks George Bush and the Bush administration had something to do with 9/11. Well, he did. You don't think so? You think the Bush administration was out to defend the American people? That's why it put in police state measures. So the idea that these are the tactics or the ideas that even if this low-level staffer thinks that somehow this is a valid statement, shows you that they have no argument except intimidation and buyouts. And it really is the inability of the American people to ridicule this stupidity. To ridicule the stupidity in themselves and the stupidity of this system, which if it continues, that stupidity won't just be stupid, it will lead to mass death. And that's kind of the difference. I think people have to grasp the sense that this will lead to mass death, but simply it should be ridiculed, it should be thrown out, and the people who persecuted it, these Wall Street bankers and their political thugs, should be put on trial for crimes against humanity. So what we're going to do this coming week is make that a clear statement to the California state legislators that unless you're supporting a fascist police state and the Wall Street policies of mass murder in Detroit, San Bernardino, Vallejo, Stockton, Oakland, and throughout the states of this country, then you better sign on to Glass-Steagall. You better support the resolution. And you better commit yourself to a real Franklin Roosevelt recovery. And I think that's a clear line we have to draw. I think the blowback is pathetic in a certain sense. I think what's maybe more pathetic is how gullible some of these state assembly members are to think that somehow they should work with these Wall Street institutions, that somehow that will save jobs for their state. I mean, what a preposterous argument. They're killing the people of their state day and night.
Mr. Speaker, it's no secret. The public has weighed in on this. This Congress is acknowledged by all parties and all spectrums as the most unproductive Congress in the history of this country. That's shameful. Polls show us 25 points behind cockroaches in popularity, 23 percentage points behind, what was the last one? Oh, root canals. We're just slightly ahead of Genghis Khan and the Communist Party in popularity. It's time that we put an end to this nonsense, put this Congress to work, postpone, cancel this recess. Let's put an end to this nonsense, get America working again, and get this country moving again. Thank you.
Time, the gentleman.
The week before Congress broke session, we escalated our mobilization in Washington, D.C. Mr. LaRouche had called for increasing the pressure on the relationship between Glass-Steagall and Wall Street, that Glass-Steagall will destroy Wall Street and the world will be better off for it. We don't need Wall Street, period. That what had been missing in our mobilization until that point had been this crucial fact. In spite of the fact that Congress did break for their summer recess, we have not. We've been continuing and escalating across the entire nation, whether this be at meet and greets, festivals, formal town halls to district offices, and we are out to keep that pressure on for as long as it takes.
On both sides of the aisle. However, when you guys went into what your solution was, that's when things went south. Because what you said was, we were going to let Dodd-Frank have its chance. Now, I don't know if you know, but this is also the line that Bernanke has been putting forward, that he was asked, what do we do in the event of another financial crisis, which of course would be completely systemic, and Bernanke said, don't worry, we have Title II, okay, Title II of Dodd-Frank. Now, so people know, this is the Orderly Liquidation Authority. This is exactly what they did in Cyprus. This is what they're attempting to do now in Detroit, where they say that to ensure the financial paper, the derivatives, more of this interest rate swaps that they did in Detroit, we will have the right to take deposits, or in the case of Detroit, steal the pensions, to ensure that the value of this financial paper is upheld. Because it's so important that these international banks, like these criminal operations like JP Morgan, maintain their status. And so what's clear now, because I know that there's been a raging fight around Glass-Steagall, which would absolutely crush this. Separate the gambling racket away from our commercial banks, let the swindlers go their own way, they're all going to collapse and all good for it. That should be the intention, bankrupt these SOBs. But what's clear to me now is that the fight to bring back Glass-Steagall has been blocked. And the head of JP Morgan today, Jamie Dimon, just came out and said he's the one against Glass-Steagall.
You can have a debate about ring fencing and Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall wasn't the problem. Remember, if you look at what happened, Fannie Mae,
they're not going to let it through because they know what it means. This will wipe these guys out. And so, I don't know, I'm just wondering, I've heard you say, let's give Dodd-Frank a chance, whereas we could move with Glass-Steagall, but why would you ever listen to the likes of these Jamie Dimon? I mean, it's a completely criminal operation with roots in fascism. I mean, it's clear. Just a final note here, but they backed a coup against FDR. They had no allegiance to this country. They have allegiance to them and their system, this international system of cartels and so forth. So with Glass-Steagall, we can bring them down. I'd just like to address that.
I'm actually quite open to exploring other strategies, including Glass-Steagall. We have a bipartisan duo John McCain and Elizabeth Warren, not two folks who start in the same place on a lot of issues, have come together and say, let's add this additional set of firewalls that is between essentially commercial banking activities, which is taking deposits and making loans, and investment banking activity, which is to write securities, take loans, package them, and write securities. That piece of the puzzle has been less of a problem in terms of causing the meltdown than the conflict between gambling with your assets. But it may be very important, and I'm willing to take a close look at it.
Now, you just said that you need to do more work on Dodd-Frank versus Glass-Steagall. Frankly, I don't believe you. I think you know exactly what the difference is. Glass-Steagall is going to destroy Wall Street, which we don't need. We don't need Wall Street in the United States. We need industry, we need agriculture. Wall Street is not interested in those things. They just demonstrated that in Detroit, where they stole the pensions of people, and no elected official has stood up to protect those Americans. And people know this is the pattern for the United States. So I just want to bring it to your attention that I don't think people believe you.
For people that don't know, Detroit is paying the bankers about 80% of what Detroit owes them. But they're paying the pensioners pennies on the dollar, what they owe them. They're throwing the people that paid into pensions out on the streets. These are people that didn't even pay into Social Security, so they're going to have nothing to fall back on. This is the case all over the world right now. Most of the population of the world is being held hostage to bail out the monetary debt, which was never our responsibility from the beginning. And if we don't, if we forget about saving Wall Street, we could actually invest a lot more in bringing back a physically productive economy. We could set up a credit system where we could invest in long-term projects and get people employed in decent work. But we need a Congress that is willing to go to bat and is willing to tell the American population that we are going to go to war for it. That we're going to look Wall Street in the eye and tell them we're not taking any of this crap anymore. And to say that Glass-Steagall is actually a bankruptcy of Wall Street, I think is the direction we have to go. And I know that you're supportive of Glass-Steagall, but I just need to know, Congress should be in D.C. right now. They shouldn't have gone on these things. They should be in D.C.
We have provided you the tools you need to join us in winning this fight. Under the main banner on the front page of the LaRouchePAC site, you'll find we've put together a list of congressional events around the nation. We're constantly updating that list, as well as putting together a daily feed through Facebook and Twitter. On the organized page, you'll find all the print material you need. The latest is the white paper we've produced titled Detroit, Arsenal of Democracy or Test Case for Fascism. Download it, study it, distribute it widely, and use it to be effective. This fight for the future of the nation is a live fight which is in no way settled, and it's in our hands to win it. The American people have taken the hit from Wall Street's losses and suffered the intentional disintegration of our nation for far too long. It's time to demand of our representation. Whose side are you on? Are you complicit in the crimes being run against the people of the United States? Are you complicit in the effective genocide of our nation? Will you flinch at the opportunity to eradicate this nation of the most deadly enemy within our own borders, Wall Street finance? That's what Glass-Steagall means, securing the general welfare of the American people at the expense of Wall Street. With the expansion of the cancer, which has come to be known as modern finance, Wall Street and the City of London will not survive a genuine restoration of Glass-Steagall. This will bring many people the world over a sigh of sweet relief.
I mean, I think it's time for people to really just, take the gloves off and recognize that they're not small. As Americans, we're actually incredibly powerful as individual people, not as some group defined as a political party or otherwise, but that a recognition needs to be made that, these institutions have failed. These parties have failed. They're disgusting. They're complete disgrace to the nation. That's not to say that individual people with the courage to speak up on the key issues, which are the destruction of this British Obama environmentalist conspiracy to undermine this nation. That's really what it is. And say it. Be courageous and say what LaRouche has had the courage to say, which is that the British Queen is an empress, and the culture that we've accepted is the culture of empire. And it manifests in our own pessimism, in our pragmatism, in our practicality. So it's time to shatter all these assumptions that we have about our society and about who we are. And it's time to really act in accordance with what history is requiring of us right now. And it is really to really usher in the Second American Revolution through Glass-Steagall and through the policies which will be implemented as a result of Glass-Steagall, because that's ultimately where we're going, is to a full recovery of this country.
I mean, first of all, anyone who is watching this website already is already greatly more qualified than 99% of the population out there, including elected officials. And that's a big hurdle that people have to get over, because a lot of what comes up is this fear of thinking that we're underlings or less qualified, or like Victor was saying, we don't have the gumption to say or do what should be done. And that's the trap. That's really the flaw of the American population right now, is giving in to the fraud of this Wall Street system, of this oligarchical system. And people really need to get a sense that Glass-Steagall is the life or death issue right now. And if we have that, and if we just go with it and, toss some salt over your shoulder but don't look back, then I think that there's not much that, the fight now can't be stopped if we do what's necessary. And the only thing that can stop us is ourselves not living up to what we should do.
Have been placing personal calls to congressional leaders and other pro-Glass-Steagall influential figures, further threatening reprisals against any people who persist in pressing for Glass-Steagall. Fourth, LaRouchePAC activists mobilizing support for Glass-Steagall have been targeted for physical attacks, vandalism, police harassment, and other active measures to blunt the growing support for breaking up the banks and throwing the top Wall Street criminals in jail. These attacks have been organized on a local-by-local basis, using whatever hooligan elements can be hired to carry out those attacks. According to one informed Washington source, Wall Street and the Obama White House were caught completely off guard by the rapid escalation of support for Glass-Steagall. The movement toward passage of the reinstatement bills moved ahead far more rapidly than anyone in the administration or the Big Six banks had expected. The fact that half of the state legislatures in the country, including New York and California, now this statement has been drafted by Jeff Steinberg, and it concerns a Glass-Steagall fight, and it's titled Wall Street Mafia in Desperate Drive to Stop Glass-Steagall. The criminal enterprise known as the Wall Street Too Big to Fail Banks is engaged in a desperate effort to block passage of Glass-Steagall. Bills have been introduced in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate to reinstate the 1933 legislation that broke up the banks into totally separate commercial and investment entities. Through a lobbying effort estimated to have cost more than $300 million, Wall Street was able to repeal Glass-Steagall in 1999. So far, 25 state legislatures have introduced or passed resolutions demanding that their congressional delegations support Glass-Steagall's passage. And major labor, farm, and civil rights organizations have also fully endorsed the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall separation. In response to, given these facts, would you please make your opening remarks?
Well, the significance of this is the fact that the relevant people have been caught right-handed, left-handed, and backhanded. And they are now, in the sense of subject to a thorough investigation before and after this proceeding is completed. In other words, they're not going to get away with this on their own basis, because they're still subject to what they've done in fraud in this case. This means hope for the United States, because the acts that have taken and the fact that they are traced to these agencies, not just these banks, but political institutions which are responsible for this sort of stuff. And therefore, that means that unless Glass-Steagall is automatic...
That nationwide outpouring of support for Glass-Steagall, Wall Street has responded with a four-pronged assault to block passage, according to well-placed Washington sources. These reports grid precisely with evidence directly obtained by LaRouchePAC organizers. First, the Big Six Wall Street banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo have unleashed their lobbyists and trade associations to target state legislators backing the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. Evidence of this operation has already surfaced in Delaware, Minnesota, South Dakota, and in California. Second, members of the U.S. House and Senate have been personally contacted by top officials of the Big Six banks and threatened with loss of campaign support and with loss of thousands of jobs in their districts unless they drop their support for the Glass-Steagall bills. Third, the CEOs and other top executives of too-big-to-fail banks introduced resolutions calling for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, indicated a level of mass public support that posed an existential threat to the very survival of the too-big-to-fail criminal enterprises of Wall Street. It should be no surprise that the too-big-to-fail banks have resorted to mafia tactics to push back against the momentum for Glass-Steagall. The banks are being protected from long overdue criminal prosecution by the Obama White House and the Justice Department, which has officially adopted the Holder Doctrine, under which the big banks, particularly their top executives, have been given a literal license to steal and murder with immunity from prosecution. With Detroit showcasing the outright genocidal consequences of such policies, as a rating of the LIBOR interest rates and the manipulation of interest rate swaps to loot the already desperate city budgets, the ability of the Obama administration to continue their protection racket is running up against a growing popular rage. The desperate Wall Street actions targeting Glass-Steagall are criminal in their own right.